So I'm going to talk to you about why you should love government. And it doesn't have to be this government that you love. It doesn't have to be the last government. I'm not even going to specify what level of government I'm talking about. But what I'm going to try and convince you of is that the notion of government, the idea that we make rules for ourselves, which we almost by definition are not going to agree on, or we wouldn't need the rules, we then enforce and impose punishment on folks for people who do not adhere to them, is the most important thing that we can do as a society. And to put a little finer point on it, so since this is essentially Econ 28 in 18 minutes, I'm going to give you a specific case. 10 years ago, it was December of 2000. I remember the time exactly because the Bush-Gore election was still being contested. There was a guy at a public policy conference. The technology boom, the dot-com boom had bust, but not completely. The hubris was still lingering. And there was a guy at the conference who stood up and he said, technology has made government irrelevant. What I'm going to do for the next 17 and a half minutes is offer a rejoinder to that statement, because I've since described it as the stupidest thing I've ever heard a smart person say. The first reason that we need government is, best illustrated, if you imagine my life since 2000, since that conference, if we didn't have any government. And I, of course, would be an extremely rich man because I would be the founder of Chuck Flicks, which is a movie where you get DVDs, you have a little queue, you mail them in, they mail them back. And you might say, well, that seems awfully familiar to Netflix. And of course it is, because I will have taken all of their software and I will use that. And this, I won't be using all of my time on this because I'll also be operating Chuck Google and Chuckosoft and a series of other high-tech ventures, all of which I've stolen from different high-tech firms, except it's not really stealing because there is no intellectual property protection in the absence of government. So if this were a criminal prosecution of this guy who stood up, I would probably rest my case now. Because the irony is that in the absence of government, there is no technology to make it irrelevant. None of those brilliant ideas, the ones that made people rich, the ones that changed our lives, the ones that made it easier for you to rent movies without having to schlep to Blockbuster, they don't happen in the absence of government because nobody protects the investment that those folks made in their proprietary technology. It's true of pharmaceuticals, it's true of inventions, it's true of the things that happen at Thayer. If you're going to drop $1 billion in finding a cure to cancer, and that is, by the way, the cost these days of bringing a new drug to market, from the time you find the cure, test it, take it through clinical trials, and then bring it to market. And what you've discovered actually only costs $1 a pill, which is not unusual at all. Then what's to stop me in the absence of some patent protection from taking your $1 billion investment and selling the pills on my own? The answer is nothing. And if there's nothing protecting me in the absence of patent protection, nobody spends that $1 billion in the first place, and you don't get the drug. The second reason you should think about it, and this is unique to the timing, actually, it makes the point very well. I said this was December of 2000. Well, we now know what was going on in December of 2000, which is there was a small but dedicated group of people who were working on 2001. My second response to this fellow is somebody needs to protect us from folks who will do us egregious harm. And it is not going to be the private sector, and it's not going to be the nonprofit sector. And the reason has to do with the specific characteristics of the kinds of things that can protect us from a threat like this, or any threat on a large group of us, whether it's a missile strike, or a dirty nuclear bomb, or water in the drinking water, or some kind of poison in the drinking water of New York City. The best way to understand why only government can protect us from that kind of threat is to think, what if we were to turn it over to a private firm? Clearly, it's very important. A lot of us value the fact that we're protected from these dangers. Certainly, somebody could make money doing it. Well, the nature of defense is that if you protect one person, suppose you were protecting the Upper Valley from some kind of strike from Etna. You know, Hanover's very worried about Norwich coming across the river. And the firm sets it up, and you protect one person in Hanover. By virtue of protecting one person, you've protected just about everybody around him or her, which means if this is your business model, once you've got one customer, and I live near that one customer, I'm not going to sign up because I'm going to be protected anyway. So what kind of business model works when once you've got one customer, you will never ever get a second? None. So if you have one person in New York City who signs up to be protected from terrorism, there's not a second. That's not a recipe for making money. You have one person who says, yes, find Osama bin Laden, hunt him down, make us all better, you don't get a second. So let's think about the nonprofit sector. Suppose we all offer up some money to pay for something like hunting terrorists or protecting ourselves from a nuclear bomb. What if you don't contribute to the effort? Then you're essentially a free rider. We can't then say, boy, all right, we are hunting down Osama bin Laden, and he contributed to that effort, but he didn't, so make sure that he gets hit. They did, but the people behind them didn't. So here's a list of people who should be vulnerable to terrorist attack, and here are people who shouldn't. Right? That doesn't work very well either. So the private sector isn't going to do something that we know is very worthwhile. The nonprofit sector isn't going to do something that we know is very, very worthwhile. Only one entity is left, which is government, which has the power to compel us each to contribute to something that we know is a worthwhile collective endeavor, but will not otherwise happen. So suppose my friend from 2000 is still not persuaded. Then I might have to resort to some different unorthodox means, which is I would move in next to his house. And of course, remember, his house is a very loose use of the term because he hasn't really recognized property rights. So I'm going to, this is my house too. And I'm going to raise a very large circus elephant in my backyard. And his backyard too, because remember, there's no property line. Municipal governments do that. So my elephant is wandering around his house periodically. And the reason this might bring home the importance of government to him is I found this online. This is why the internet's so wonderful. Elephants crap an average of 1 to 200 pounds a day. And remember, my elephant is wandering around his house because there is no boundary, and I would say after about 7 to 10 days, so we're talking 1,400 to 2,000 pounds of crap around his house, he's going to say, I got a problem here. And I'm going to say, what are you talking about? This is the market at work. This is beautiful. I bought the elephant. I thought I got a very good deal. I've hired a trainer. He's doing a top-notch job. Trainer's happy. I'm happy. The elephant salesman's happy. What's the problem? This is, the market works on voluntary transactions that leave all parties better off. And he says, I'm not very happy at all because there's 2,000 pounds of crap in my backyard. And I'm going to say, yes, this is why we need government. Because there are a whole host of transactions that make the parties very happy, and they impose serious harm on third parties who had nothing to do with that transaction. Most of them are a lot more serious than my circus elephant, although this does explain why we have zoning laws, and you probably can't raise an elephant in downtown Hanover. But if you think about most of our environmental problems, they are a function of externalities. You do something, whether it's driving, and you take into account your private costs and your private benefits, and you do it or don't do it. You do not take into account the social costs you impose on others, like my elephant wandering around this guy's house. So you don't think about the pollution that your car generates. If you're running a factory and dumping lead into the river, you don't think about the people downstream who may be poisoned or lose their fishing abilities or anything like that. As a result, we do a whole host of things in the absence of some kind of regulation that actually end up making us worse off collectively as a result. One serious example would be water pollution. Until the Clean Water Act, an act of government, we weren't terribly serious about protecting our rivers and streams and everything else. When did it become obvious that we needed to get a little more serious about this? Does anyone know what motivated the Clean Water Act? It was when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire. For real, right? When a river catches on fire, it's a signal that maybe you're abusing a resource that could be used better. Why does a river catch on fire? Because you've got all kinds of industrial users who are essentially acting like me, the elephant owner. They're not taking into account the damage done to this collective resource. And until you step in, you being some kind of collective entity in the form of government, you're going to have rivers catching on fire. You're going to have circus elephants wandering around your house, crapping pretty much everywhere. All right, here's a totally different example. So how many of you own a car or have driven a car? How many of you have been to a gas station in the last month? How many of you wondered while you were pumping gas, am I actually getting a gallon of gasoline every time that thing says I'm getting a gallon? All right. How many of you actually have done anything about it? How many of you are deeply concerned rather than just wondering because you definitely have like 3 or 4 minutes on your hand? Right? It's not really a serious concern. And the reason it's not really a serious concern is because we collectively pay somebody to make sure that you're getting a gallon of gasoline when you pump in your car. It's the person from Grafton County or Cook County in Chicago where I live who comes out, certifies that pump, and sticks a sticker on it. Now, why does that make sense? Well, in this example, it's not terribly important, but what it does is lower the transactions cost for us. It makes it much easier
for us to pull into a gas station without having to verify every time you get off and pump gas that you're actually getting a gallon. Think about how difficult life becomes if your most mundane transactions are plagued by all kinds of informational doubts and concerns. You go to the co-op, you don't actually know if you're going to get cottage cheese in the container or not, or if somebody's put stones in it. If you've done business in the developing world, a shocking and sad amount of your time will actually be spent verifying those kinds of things. Somebody will put stones in your bag of rice. Somebody will give you counterfeit currency. And as a result, it is much, much harder to do business in those kinds of places where you don't have somebody from Grafton County coming along and for pennies for each of us, because we contribute to paying that salary, making sure you're getting a gallon of gasoline so, and this is the important part, you don't have to, which means that transactions move more quickly, markets move better. Government creates the tracks on which the engine of capitalism runs. And if you don't take the tracks for granted, then you realize when you do something like this that there is no market, or at least not a well-functioning market, if somebody's not doing that well. That somebody is government. All right, so I'm talking about government writ large. I am not talking about the way necessarily that we do it. Should we be protecting sugar companies by limiting the amount of sugar that comes into the United States? No, we should not. Should we be protecting you from ferrets? I don't think so. I think the state of California makes it illegal to own a ferret. I don't understand the logic of that. Should we protect you from yourself by requiring you to wear a motorcycle helmet? Vermont says yes. New Hampshire says no. That one's debatable. How much of your money should we take away to give to somebody who's less fortunate? That one's eminently debatable. Should we be attacking terrorists in Pakistan with pilotless drones and perhaps killing civilians in the process? That one is also eminently debatable. So I'm not by any means justifying everything that's going on. I'm not saying that what we're supposed to be doing, we're doing terribly well. What I'm arguing is we need, if you believe, if I've convinced you that government's important, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about what government should and should not do and move away from the very silly argument about whether big government is better than small government and so on. It's utterly essential that we do some things. Whether we do these things is debatable. This is where we should put our effort if we want to make life better. The other point I want to make is that government is not only important, it's more important than it ever was before. If you compare 2010 to 1950 or 1850, and you think about the things I've just told you about, all of them are more important. The kinds of jobs you're going to be doing as Dartmouth students, the kinds of jobs we do as a relatively rich country, depend more than ever on the protection of intellectual property. In 1950, we were mostly manufacturing. You kind of grinded out the products, you sold them. Technology was important in some cases, but certainly not like it is with the software industry, not like it is with our advanced pharmaceutical industry. So to the extent that technology and knowledge are more important than they were 100 years ago or 50 years ago, then government protecting intellectual property is more important than it ever was. National defense. It is true that we were attacked in 1941. There have been wars and external threats for as long as people have been able to come up with weapons. It is also true that it is much easier now to attack anywhere on a larger scale with less notice. There could be a dirty bomb in Atlanta or Chicago or Moscow tomorrow morning. We would not see troops massing. We will always be caught off guard, as we were with 9/11. So to the extent that the capacity to destroy people is bigger than it ever was, a lot of it driven by nuclear technology, then the importance for an effective national defense is more important than it ever was before. Externalities, well, the one I didn't mention when I was talking about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire is climate change. Now we have externalities. I mean, my circus elephant was relatively local. There's only so much damage he can do in the neighborhood. The nature of climate change is when you get in your car to drive home from this event, you are affecting people's lives in Canada, in Shanghai, in the north of Alaska, and vice versa. When they get in their car, when China decides how it's going to develop, when they decide whether or not they're going to allow auto ownership to grow at the rate it's growing, when India decides what the price of gasoline is going to be, every one of those decisions will affect you. What that means is government, as it's currently constrained to mostly national governments and relatively weak international institutions, may not be up to the task that we have to do in terms of dealing with international externalities, costs that are going to spill over national boundaries. And then, of course, transactions costs. In 1950, let alone 1850, you were not buying manufactured goods from China. You were not wondering whether your toys, what the lead content was. You were not sending money off to a retirement account called Fidelity in Boston. How many of you ever mailed off a check to a retirement account or something like that? Did you ever wonder whether you were ever going to see your money again or not? That's the equivalent, only much more serious, to wondering whether or not there's going to actually be a gallon of gasoline in your tank. So to the extent we can shepherd that process and referee the kinds of entities you're dealing with, the things that other countries may be doing to you, we can facilitate global business. If you can lower the cost of doing business around the world, you facilitate transactions, you make people richer and better. The other thing to mention, just writ large, is the countries now and in the future that do this well are the countries that are rich and prosperous. The countries that can't do this, that can't protect their citizens, that can't protect the things that are being invented, are the ones that are struggling. And if you look around the world, it's not the places without functioning governments that are rich and prosperous in the home of the .com industry. It's countries like the United States that are doing a reasonable job overall. So let me finish with, I guess, an admonition, which is that if I've persuaded government is important, and perhaps you've looked at some of the things that we do and don't do, and you're still persuaded that government probably isn't as good as it could be, let me argue for why you ought to do something about it. So what the introduction did not say is that since I've had some of the students in this auditorium, a year ago I ran for Congress in Chicago for Rahm Emanuel's seat. And I lost, which is why I'm here. Although, don't tell my children because they still think I'm working on health care legislation in Washington and they're very proud of me. One of the striking things about this race is that there were 20-some candidates. There were Republicans, there were Democrats, there were Green Party candidates. So arguably, there was a candidate for everybody. And it was a really serious time. So the election was a year ago, year and a half ago. The campaign was a little longer. It was the depth of the financial crisis. This was the most uncertain time in the United States since the 1930s. If you know Illinois, we had just indicted our second governor in a row. You may know him from The Celebrity Apprentice. We knew him as our governor, Rod Blagojevich. And the governor before him was already in jail, so people were completely discouraged by the political process. Things were as bad as they could get, locally, nationally, and all the other international threats. So, and you have 20-some candidates, so there's a lunatic in the race for every flavor. You really have no excuse for not supporting somebody. In our race, the turnout was 20%. So for all that was going on, 8 out of 10 registered voters, those are the people who bothered to register, didn't show up. And my message to you is, one, government's important, and two, if you treat it like the Chicago Cubs, which is it disappoints you year after year after year, but there's nothing really you can do about it, then you're kind of going to get what you deserve. It's not like the Cubs. It is not a spectator sport. And if you think it's important, and if you think we're not doing it as well as we could, then it's really up to you to make it better. Because really, government is nothing but a collection of us. And so if you think it matters, do something about it. Thank you very much.